What's one of the laws that might impact those who are incarcerated?
The United Nations calls anything more than 3 days of solitary confinement torture. And there are individuals who have spent weeks and months and years inside of solitary confinement. And that absolutely has an effect on them and their family, the people that they're surrounded with, the law enforcement officials, correction officers that have to deal with them. That has a tremendously negative effect for so many. And what we helped do was to limit that, reduce that.
Welcome to 365 Brothers, the podcast. I'm your host, Robin Shine. I am delighted to bring to you brothers from across the United States and from various professions talking about their life experiences, their wisdom, and a conversation that also touches on racial profiling in the United States, how pervasive it is, what the impact is. And remember, you can follow us on Instagram at 365 Brothers. Also, follow us on Facebook at 365 Brothers, the podcast. If this is your first time listening to a 365 Brothers episode, make sure you subscribe because you do not want to miss one brother's wisdom, one brother's experience, and their perspective on life in the United States.
Today, we are speaking to a gentleman who is from and still resides in Central Islip, that's in Long Island, New York. And he is an author, an activist, and an entrepreneur. Today, we are speaking with Gahrey Ovalle. Welcome, Gahrey.
Hey, Robin, how are you today? Pleasure to be here.
Same here. I'm having a good day. First, before we get into the questions, is there anything that you'd like to share with the listeners to help them get to know you better?
Sure. I am an author, an activist, and an entrepreneur. And in all of those spaces, I really concentrate on creating healing in Black and Brown communities. In the author space, I talk about these conversations that are really important for us. In the activism space, we're working on changing laws and getting elected officials in place that perform better for our communities. And in the entrepreneur space, I help individuals build their 6- and 7-figure businesses so they can create that financial freedom that allows them to move on in their life and have the most impact in their lives, their family, and their community.
Awesome. So, let's dive in. What is your favorite song or movie, either now or all time?
I don't have a favorite song or a favorite movie, but what I do is consume content that's in alignment with how I'm feeling or what I'm doing.
Here's how I'm going to rephrase that question for you.
Yeah.
You are stuck in an alternate dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And in that dimension, they are going to play a song as your background song. And it will play 24/7, awake and sleep. And you will need to listen to that.
Mm-hmm.
What would you pick? Even if it's not your favorite, but you had to pick a song that's your background.
Sure. So for me, if I had to do something like that, I still concentrate on my production and my creation. And at that point, I'm listening to something that allows me to enhance that. So usually I'll have something like a Beethoven, a Moonlight Sonata playing in the background, just instrumental, let that run so I can dive deep into my own thoughts and create the most powerful, amazing things for others.
Perfect. What is a favorite moment from your childhood?
So my childhood was all about me hanging out and running around with my siblings, right? So I have some older siblings and then I have a younger sibling. And most of my childhood memories are right around that, right? Playing games and sports. We were really competitive with each other when we were young. So it allowed for us to, one, get pretty physical, pretty tough when we're playing against each other, but also elevate ourselves to that next level because we would push ourselves more than anybody else. And then what happens is it translated into this unbelievable excellence on the athletic field once we started getting into the high school sports and school athletics and things like that.
I'm sure there are all kinds of sports. Like I think about my childhood, it's like I was not competitive that way. I was not doing sports. I did track in junior high school. But, around the neighborhood, we would play hide and go seek. We would play tag. We would play some kickball, some softball. But my favorite really was, in all honesty, something as basic as hide and go seek, because I loved finding the perfect spot. So when we weren't playing a game and I was in the neighborhood and we were doing anything else, I was constantly on the lookout. So I was like, okay, when next time we play, right? So that was my thing, like finding the perfect place, which I'm sure psychologists could have a lot of fun with. But anyway, find the perfect place to hide. But so when you think back to your time running around playing those games, what was a particular sport, a particular game, something that you guys did that really was like, now that was us doing our thing?
When we were younger, we played them all, right? Basketball, football, baseball, softball, soccer, wiffle ball, right? Made no difference. We just played. So I have a couple older siblings that are a few years older than me. So I was able to play with them and their teammates. And because I was playing at that higher level, it just allowed me to develop in a totally other way than kids my age. So when I got to playing ball in school with kids my age, it wasn't even a comparison at that point, right? I was just leaps and bounds ahead of them because I was playing with individuals that were 6, 7, and 10 years older than me for a period of time. So it gave me such an advantage when I stepped onto the athletic field at that point.
All right, so let's talk about accomplishments. And I asked this question in 2 parts. First, an accomplishment that means the most to you personally, and then an accomplishment that when others hear it, it's the one that more often than others, you get the, oh, or wow. So let's start with the first of your accomplishments. Which is the one that means the most to you personally?
So the greatest accomplishment for me, and there's so many things that could fill that space, but the one that I'm most proud of is my family, right? Raising my family and growing them in a way where they're very successful in their own right as well. For me, my family, they're my guiding light and my driving force. And, this January is going to make 25 years that my wife and I are married. And we have raised 2 amazing human beings. They have graduated university at this point. They are now pursuing their own professional careers, and their trajectory is amazing. And to see that is absolutely so satisfying and so beautiful. And at this point, my wife and I are now empty nesters, or at least we were before COVID brought everybody back home, right? But we're slowly getting back to some kind of normal, and they'll be up and out again. So that, without a doubt, is the thing that I am most proud of. And for the second question, I still think it lines up beautifully. People are they love the fact that my wife and I, we got married. We were college sweethearts. We got married immediately thereafter. We decided to have children early. We wanted to be done early so we could enjoy our lives early. That conversation is absolutely beautiful. People love that.
Fantastic. Let's talk about words. What is a favorite quote, saying, metaphor, or book, and why?
Yeah. For me, that was pretty easy. The autobiography of Malcolm X. Right? That book shaped my life and my understanding of the world we live in. And I probably picked that up in my high school years. And it just helped me to understand the Black and brown experience in this country in a historical context. And it gave me that vantage point from which I can see the world, from which I currently live in. And that it imprinted upon me the importance of activism and fighting for our community. And most important, it just left me with absolute clarity. There are certain parts of this country that do not want us here, and they never did. And they are unfair, they are cruel, and they occupy positions of power from which they continue to cause pain and suffering for our communities. And our fight remains. And that's what I was left with at the end of that book. And that is as true when I read it more than 20 years ago as it is today, as it was when he was living and living his life and sharing his experience with us.
Yeah. And I can tell that it informs what you do, amongst the many things you've done as an activist. And I'm sure, like, in some sense, everything you do could probably fit in alignment with that. But what's something that you are incredibly proud of that you've accomplished in terms of your activism? in line with that?
Sure. What we do is we concentrate on creating healing in Black and Brown communities. So what that means for us is passing laws that affect us, right? Mass incarceration is a reality for us in our communities. We make up 80 to 90% of some of these prison populations. And as such, I want to make sure that we are creating change for those inside, for those outside, and the transition in between. So this legislative season, the one that just passed, we passed 7 different bills inside of the New York legislation that impacted individuals inside, families outside, the experience in between. And that's just monumental, right? Most people are lucky to get 1 or 2 that passes during a legislative session. We had the foresight to create coalition and collaboration early, and that effort allowed us to just be so impactful across the board. We just have such a strong coalition at this point that making change, getting elected officials in office or out of office, those things have a profound impact on us and our communities. And I spend a lot of time there as well.
What's one of the laws that might impact those who are incarcerated?
Halt solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is a tool used in the mass incarceration system, and it's oftentimes used as absolute punishment, right? Absolute punishment towards us. It's not enough that we're doing our time. We have to be punished while we're doing our time. And what happens is people get sent to that solitary housing unit or the box or whatever it is you call it, right? They get sent into that solitary space. And the United Nations calls anything more than 3 days of solitary confinement torture. And there are individuals who have spent weeks and months and years inside of solitary confinement. And that absolutely has an effect on them and their family, the people that they're surrounded with, the law enforcement officials, correction officers that have to deal with them. That has a tremendously negative effect for so many. And what we helped do was to limit that, reduce that. We don't want to take that away completely from law enforcement because I recognize its use and ability in a positive fashion to help someone in a way, shape, or form. But we want to make sure it's not being used as punishment. And that was one of the things that we started to just make sure more accountability is part of that equation. So when individuals do go to the box or to solitary, there's more documentation. There are more restrictions. You can't just send anybody willy-nilly. You can't just do it because you don't like somebody. There's accountability in that space now, and that impacts them in a major way.
That's amazing. That is fantastic. I really appreciate you expanding on that because while we may hear often about mass incarceration, and we know that we are disproportionately represented in prison populations, in jail populations, a lot of times, unless someone in our family, someone we personally know are having that experience, we don't appreciate that it's not just that there are systems inside the system that can aggravate. And as you were talking, I was thinking about those stories I have heard of, the impact on the mental health. And for some, like they never return to their regular mental health. Yeah. Never. When this has gone on for months and years.
That mental health conversation, Robin, I don't think we've ever gotten actual numbers, but I've seen things upwards of 70% of individuals that are incarcerated suffer from some kind of mental illness or mental health issue. Knowing that, how do we keep just policing these people? They need mental help. And that's what they're not receiving. So I love that you address that because it's so powerful to the conversation. And this is our larger conversation, right? About policing in our communities. We don't want to be policed, right? That's not what we're here for. And that's not what we're asking them for. We want them to do their job, right? Their job is valuable and very necessary at times. But when there's not a police or criminal matter, don't send those kind of individuals to address the problem. Send the people who are going to solve that problem. Yeah. So domestic abuse, mental health, like whatever it is, send a professional in that space because police officers are not trained in all of those modalities and they cannot possibly provide us the best solution when they show up.
I so appreciate you saying that because, so often we hear defund the police and people will jump to, oh, that means you don't want police. It'll be crazy. And it's like, no, there's a nuance there. It's like you're saying, it's funding people who know how to work with the homeless, interact with the homeless. Most of the homeless have mental health issues. So then they should be trained in that, right? You can't just say, get up, get up, get up, Anyway, so thank you for that. And I think that also gives our listeners a great sense of the kind of work that you're doing, and may even inspire someone to find out how they can make a difference in some of the laws in that area. So thank you. Now, back to you. What is a significant person, moment, or event that either changed the trajectory of your life or it had a significant impact on your life?
Nice. I love that question, because that's a powerful question for anybody, right? To identify what that moment is, that person is. It really helps us understand our place in the world we build and create for ourselves. So I was fortunate, and I had the opportunity as a child to watch my mother, who was a community activist in her heyday. And I had a chance to watch someone who loved her family and community enough to affect change in them. And what happened was, my mother knew that when she moved from New York City out to Long Island, she wanted to make sure that she created a better environment for her children. But in order to do that, she had to create a better environment for everyone's children. So she stepped up into that space, and she realized, all right, I'm just going to start doing good for everyone, and that will help my children as well. And what happened was, the community got better. It got safer. It got more beautiful. And we had more opportunity. And she did it. And at that point, I knew, like, this little tiny woman is telling everybody what to do, and they're doing it. And it's making things better. And at that point, as a child, learning those lessons, seeing those things, it left an indelible mark on me. And I knew in that moment that I had every ability to create change in the world, the change I want to see and be. We just have to go out and do this work. So I had a chance to watch her do that. And I was able to then implement those lessons in my life, right? So I learned those lessons somewhere about that 7, 8, 9 years old. I implemented it right through junior high school, college, marriage, my professional career. Like, I implemented it in all of those spaces. And as a result, just had an amazing experience. It really boiled down to that, because when you learn those lessons, you can't unlearn them. Right. It's like, and I mentioned this to you earlier when we were talking. It's like learning how to read. I dare you to unlearn it. I dare you. Yeah. Go ahead. You can't once you learn these things. And for me, that's what it was like, seeing that moment where someone had the ability to create so much good for so many others.
Tell us a little bit about some of the things that she was able to affect in the community that added more beauty, more safety. Give us a couple of examples.
Sure. So, contextually now, this is late 70s, right? Where we're moving from the city into Long Island. And at that point in time, the community we moved into, there was a lot of gang activity. There was a lot of drug activity. Because of that, there was a little bit of homelessness issue. There was a little bit of litter and just kind of just like a lack of care around the neighborhood. And what she did was, she came in and immediately she started to protest any and all of these drug houses that were in the community. And she'd be out there with picket signs and a group of people, and they would be yelling and chanting to get people to move out and go. And they did. And those communities, that same little area, started to get redeveloped as a result. And now it's one of the most beautiful areas in this town. And that happened as a result of her activity. Another major component, and this is national now, the Neighborhood Watch, that was designed off of my mother's community patrol. Yeah. And she got funded at the federal level, at the state level, and she implemented that thing, and she made it possible for others to do it. And that's where that thing was born from.
Wow. That is amazing. Like, I'm floored. As soon as you said that, we lived in apartments a lot. And then my mom and stepdad bought a home on the west side of Long Beach. That was my first home. And I still remember the orange and black Neighborhood Watch sign, and it stood out for me because I hadn't seen those signs in my apartment living. Now, I'm not saying they didn't happen, they didn't have them, but I just remember I can still see that window on the west side, on that home on Delta, and the little thing. And I was like, wow, everybody around here is like looking out for everybody. That is so cool. As a little kid going, everybody here looks out for everybody.
It makes a difference in our
Right.
upbringing and our experience in communities who watch and care for each other. It really does.
And I love knowing that I have just connected 1 degree away or 2nd degree from the woman who took that on and created the blueprint for something that has really altered communities across the country.
That's right.
That's awesome. Thank
That's
you for
right.
sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. So that was my experience.
Look,
and that was the most impactful for me. Right?
Now, everything you said about what you do, we're clear.
It makes total sense, total alignment now. I see where it comes from.
We got the example that you grew up with. Woo! That's amazing. That's really cool. So, Gahrey, what is a moment or an event that signifies or in some way highlights your experience as a Black man in the United States?
Robin, that can just be filled with so many different notes and experiences. So for me, it was the procession of people that came through that my mother would help along their way in their experience. And I kept hearing all of these war stories, and I kept hearing all of this discrimination and bias and bigotry and unfairness in these systems that we had to go through: housing, employment, healthcare, law enforcement, schools. It was a nonstop procession of individuals and their problems that I had a chance to see and listen to and eavesdrop when I was younger. So it wasn't things that I was going through in those moments, but that's when I learned it. And that's when it cemented for me before I even had the chance to experience the system itself, right? Mm-hmm. As I got older, I then started to realize, my goodness, this thing affects all of us, no matter where we are, no matter how well we do, no matter how well connected we are. This thing has the ability to reach out and touch us personally, the unfairness and injustice of the system. And in those moments, that's when I just recognize I have to create as much insulation as I possibly can between me.
So what is one of the moments that happened to you?
My younger brother was incarcerated for a bit unjustly, and there was quite a bit of harassment throughout the entire process. This is police officers, prosecutors, judges, judicial misconduct while he was incarcerated in upstate New York. When he came home on parole, the entire system is a problem. It's not just one moment, it's all of it. And it's not just us, it's all of us. So for me, I was able to experience and learn that, not just through some of my own interactions, but more so through the interactions of others. I kept myself pretty tight, in terms of my experience. And I really did as much as I could, like I said, to create as much insulation between me and law enforcement, me and any system that could be prejudiced against me, which is one of the reasons why I jumped into entrepreneurship, right? I never had to experience the bias and bigotry of employment because I was never employed, right? I never had to deal with that. So I created insulation for myself, but I know it still exists, even though I didn't have to go through it. So ultimately, it's the collection of all of those experiences and unfairness that really stands out for me and highlights our experience as Black men in this country.
Speaking of which, have you had any interactions with law enforcement? And if so, what, when?
My experience is a little different than most. I mentioned that my mother was a community activist, and as such, she was a liaison between the community and law enforcement. So we saw law enforcement all the time when we were growing up. We were raised around law enforcement. Not that anybody in our family was, but we constantly dealt and interacted with them. So I grew up in a space where community policing was the approach. And that's a wonderful space to grow up in, right? They know your names, They show up to your games. They celebrate your success. They're friendly. That's the environment that I started to grow up in. Now, when I left that space and entered the world, I started to experience the other side of that, right? Like the constant harassment from police, the stop and frisk, the driving while black. But before all of that, I remember that time fondly. And throughout the remainder of my experience, as I got into my adult years, like I said, my brother was incarcerated, and dealing with the incarceration system and the legal system in that space, right? Having to deal with the harassment from DOCCS, which is the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. When my brother returned home, he's done. He satisfied his requirement. Why are you still harassing him? Why are you still attempting to violate him on trumped up charges because he didn't do anything? There's a revolving door in the system that we experience, and ultimately we have to, make the choices and that allow us to escape that. But any and all of those spaces, right? Those are some of the spaces where I personally were affected.
Well, I want to actually go back to growing up in a community in which you actually got to experience community policing. There's a lot of conversation about nationally, locally, about implementing more community policing. And I know that in some cases, community policing has simply looked like adding a precinct in the community, but the police are still, interacting in the same way. And it sounds like you had a different, I hear that you actually had a different experience. How did your mom, because it sounds like your mom was a source of creating that, of leading that, right? Yeah. How did she create that? And then there are so many brothers and sisters who would love to have experienced community policing and hear that it's something, it like exists as some heavenly possibility. So what was that like to as lived? There we go.
Yeah. So listen, Robin, it was fantastic. It really was. Right? We did not fear the police in that sense. Right? We recognized that we could turn to them for help and we would actually receive it. They lived in our communities.
What? Hold on. Wait a minute. What you say?
Yeah, they lived in our communities. And because of that, they understood us. Community policing is just that. Get down to the community level, experience that, share that lived experience with them, and then make it better. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're charged with. Law enforcement is not a job. They are oath takers. They have to take an oath because it's just like a medical profession. They have to take an oath. They have to swear to do good because it's not an easy task. There are lines that are going to be a little blurry and hazy. Continue to do your best, right? I grew up in a space where those individuals honored that and they came to work that way. And it'd be totally amazing to, at the end of the game, high fives from local law enforcement that stopped by to celebrate you on your game because you scored a winning touchdown or you got to hit your first hit or something like, right? You scored a goal. It was amazing to experience that. And it brought us so much closer and it allowed our community to work with each other. Now, my mother recognized that that's not an easy line to walk, and someone has to be able to be a liaison between the community and the police department, because not everybody wants to speak to law enforcement. Not everybody has a clean record at times, and they're worried about, hey, if I open the door to this one problem, do they then pick me up on another thing that exists, right? Like we live in fear to say something because we know there might be something in our record or on our license or something that's disturbing or would cause them to further escalate. We're afraid to do that. There was a time where I grew up and a time in a space where they worked with you. They identified your issue. They would show up and speak at your schools, and they would show up all the time and give back in that capacity. And it was a wonderful way to see that and walk into that. And this is also a time when they were still walking around the community, right? So those things don't happen anymore, but there are still ways to implement parts and pieces of that. So even though they're in their patrol units and their patrol cars, they still have the ability to stop and talk and interact And we love it when we see these things happening, when social media shares it with us. The local cop who stops at a basketball court and shooting the hoops with a bunch of kids in the neighborhood, right? It's a beautiful thing and a beautiful moment. Why does that have to be an isolated event now? That should be the norm.
I really appreciate some of the things you've shared. A couple things stand out for me. First of all, the key ingredient in community policing really is being in that community and living there so that you're invested. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know how you enforce that or whatnot, but it would have to be a new model, right? Mm-hmm. That's right. So there's that. But the other thing is you actually got me thinking about, on the court, what it looks like as a police officer, because as you were saying about, needing a community liaison, my imagination immediately went to like a situation where maybe there's a guy who's been selling minuscule amounts of some pills or something. You know what I'm saying? Like Adderall to some kids, which should not be done. I get that. But nonetheless, in that capacity, in the little corner they were doing that, witnessed a more serious crime, a sexual assault, a, armed robbery. Now, coming forward, why were you there? What were you doing? That is going to create the possibility of that person getting jammed up. So they're going to stay quiet. And I'm not even dealing with a no snitch policy, but let's just look at maybe this person really does, want to help. Maybe it's a sexual assault of a young woman who's 12, 13, and this, really tugs at them. And so I say all that because you're really making it clearer for me as an officer, that line, right? Mm-hmm. That, do I give a walk on selling some Adderall to a 15-year-old so that I can catch a potential rapist, a pedophile, and that balance is happening all the time? There's nuance on all sides of that. And that there's room, I think there's room for the community to really understand policing in the same way that there's room for police to understand the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that is the critical point of community policing. It's not just them. We have to meet them on the other side of that. We have to be able to make that transition and those results happen between us. It's not just what they're going to do for us. It's not what we're going to do for them. It's what we do together. And that's why there has to be someone or a group of someones in the community who help that transition, who help the conversation, who help pass along information, who help create the result, who shows up, bodies, boots on the ground, bodies in the field. Like, we need both of those things to happen in order for it to be a successful model. And I loved that you identified, we're talking about a brand new model here, or going back to an older model, just in its, in today's way, shape, and form, how we can implement it. Those are the realities. And we have to be as responsible as law enforcement in terms of the results in our community. And I would say that we're even more responsible for those results.
I really, really love this conversation because it points to the need for some, it points to your mom, really. Like, what are we willing to do?
Yeah.
What role are we willing to play in the safety of our communities? Mm-hmm. And that it is a give and take, that there, and I know I'm not trying to whitewash the historical biases that are embedded in policing, so it's not about, so we just need to work with them better. But there is a need for us to revisit, what role are we willing to play?
That is exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, that's awesome. If the United States was a woman with whom you could speak, whether she's a lover, a mother, a stranger, a neighbor, a friend, what would you say to the United States if you could talk to her?
First, I would say I'm sorry. There's nothing more detrimental to our communities than how we treat women and children. It's the greatest source of loss in our communities and across the world. I would say you deserve better, and that I will continue to be an ally in your fight for equity, fairness, and justice. So I've come to realize, and I realized this early, and I stated it in my book, women will heal this planet because they have given birth to it. Mm. And what that means is that as women occupy more positions of power, as they have more influential positions, we will continue to see conventional definitions of business, power, and government being redefined. And I'm all for that because that's a good thing. And then we would probably move into how do we make it better, and how do we continue to elevate the voices of women and continue to put them in positions of power. And it's through activism that happens, but that's the conversation to be had for sure.
Gotcha. What is a moment that exemplifies?
The birth of my children, the best ever, the best ever. And it will continue to be the best. Like that continues to give back to me over and over and over again.
Tell us about that moment.
When you finally, when you finally get pregnant and then bring life into this planet, that experience is like nothing else. It's the most powerful thing that you can be around. For me, it was deeply humbling. I remember crying my eyes out when my children were born, right? Like just absolutely beautiful, because you recognize how delicate life is and how powerful it can be. And then ultimately, like there's a level of responsibility for those of us who choose, right, to step into that space. There's a level of responsibility that comes with that. And all of that hits you at the same moment, like all of it. So that for sure was the best moment, right? If I had to put it on a moment, that would be it,
Awesome. All right. So now, what is a practice that has served you well? And please be specific. What's something you do, how often, and how did you discover this particular practice?
This has to be personal development, right? The answer. Once I started to realize that there was a thing called personal development, and I started to realize everything that went into it, all the accountability and the consistency and the discipline, and ultimately the results that it yielded, the quality of life that it brings. Once I understood that, I dove into that headfirst, and I kept optimizing myself as I grew older. So in my 20s, I started to identify, hey, I don't want to work for others. I want to jump into entrepreneurship. And in that space, I made as many mistakes as you could make, right? Working way too hard. Business was the most important, sacrificing sleep and health. When I started to see and recognize, hey, there's this thing out here that allows me to concentrate on making myself better. And in that way, it leverages opportunity in every other area of your life. Well, let me start trying it. Let me see what it looks like when I eat better, when I sleep more, when I practice mindful meditation, when I use exercise and movement, when I practice digital detox. What happens when I put all of that together and I do it over a period of time? And what happened was I kept optimizing portions of my life, and they kept getting better. And then there was no slip back. You know that as we go forward, you might have to go take 2 steps back and then keep going forward. That doesn't happen when you begin to optimize your life, where you are running fully optimized. You no longer have those setbacks. Everything kind of works exactly as it needs to, because that's what you draw into your life. It was personal development that allowed me to understand exactly how powerful I am as a human being and how I create my life as I want it, good, bad, and indifferent. Yeah. And when I learned to accept responsibility for that and hold myself accountable, forget it. Everything's continued to move in a beautiful space. And this is where my success has been, both personally and professionally.
So when I propose that question, I have in my mind, like what it looks like, right? And so it's a particular thing. Maybe it's, one of the gentlemen I interviewed, it was stretching every morning. Another person's journaling, it's this and that. And what I really take away from what you're sharing in the general sense of personal development is that it is a constant inquiry into what's available. And and I really relate to what you're saying as the person who's asking the questions. I sometimes am in awe, right? Because I'll hear an answer like, I journal every day. Or someone say, I pray this every night and I do this. I'm like, dang, I don't do there's nothing I do that's the same all the time. Yeah. But what I am constantly doing is finding this thing, maximizing that thing, going over here and doing this other thing. And, some of them stick. Like I walk my half marathons, and that's my motivation to continue walking, on a regular basis. That's stuck. Drinking water, that's stuck. Getting up and doing yoga every morning, didn't stick. But what I really hear is a commitment to growth, a commitment to, as you use the word, optimize. I really get the whole world of that. Like I've taken lots of courses, and right now I'm not taking courses, but I'm taking everything I got from all the courses I've taken. And now I'm adding that in with what I'm doing next, So thank you so much. Yeah.
I would just like to add to that, Robin.
Yeah, sure.
On the personal development side, as we continue to get better in our own space, it profoundly affects our personal space, our business space, our relationships, our health, our wealth. Like that, it has the ability to affect all of those spaces, our relationships, right? So we want to make sure that, when we have that conversation, we recognize it's not just personal development for the sake of it, right? It's doing that because of how profoundly it affects so many other areas of our life.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Well, so many cool things have come up in this conversation for me. That's why I love doing these interviews. Every unique individual that I get to talk to that I normally would never have gotten a chance to talk to. So for you, what did you get for yourself personally out of participating in this conversation?
One, connection, right? I have met this beautiful human being on the other side of the screen. And we are now going to be able to continue, right, the growth of that relationship as we continue to move forward, because we are occupying the same space, which is healing our communities. So that's the first thing, right, that immediately jumps out. The second thing is going through questions like that allows me to just continue to define and refine my understanding of myself. And the better I understand myself, the better quality of life I have, the more I can give to others because I understand myself better. And it just allows me to be a better example to others. And it helps me shape and craft those conversations that I might want to have with other people to help impact their lives. And these conversations, I love them for that reason, because they're so powerful, and they help us expand our own universe, right? Within and inside and outside. So that's what really stands out to me. And that's what some of the things that I'm taking away from this experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm always left with a sum of view of all the brothers that I interact with. And you are optimized community. Because at first I was thinking you optimize like yourself, you know what I mean? Like growth, but really like even in that, your commitment is so clearly about the community that you've grown up in and that you live in, that you reside in. And even when you talk about like your favorite memories, it's the community of your siblings. You know what I'm saying? It's not just siblings. It really was a sense of the community of being siblings, the community in which you grow up in. And it's also clear that what you want is, if this is what community is today, then let's have it get bigger. Let's have it grow. Let's have it get stronger, strengthen and grow, strengthen and grow. like sometimes I'll say, if you lived on a corner, here's the corner you would live on. You would live, you actually where 3 intersections meet: strengthen, community, optimize. That is where you are. And thank you for being that commitment in the world. And thank you for all that you do to demonstrate it for us, because I know just myself, in having had this conversation with you, I am much more aware of the possibility of community in a way that even through all these different conversations I have, community, but you really have brought it to life. And I can honestly say, like, I feel community in my heart. So thank you for being that in the world.
Awesome. Oh, that was so beautiful, Robin. Thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it. And you are exactly right. Strength, community, optimization. That's the space in which I occupy, and I am happy to do so. I continue to enjoy this journey as I move forward.
Look at that smile. See, y'all on audio, so y'all don't know. But just know he is beaming with the joy of what that life provides.
Remember, you can follow us on Instagram at 365 Brothers. Also, follow us on Facebook at 365 Brothers, the podcast. Lastly, I just want to let you know, producing a podcast, it takes something, and I'm really grateful to have partnered with alidu.com. They make publishing easy. There's a link in the show notes for anyone who either has a podcast or is thinking about a podcast. You don't need to learn all that sound balancing and compression. Save all that. Use your time for what matters: interviewing and sharing the stories that your podcast brings. Thank you for listening to 365 Brothers. Certainly hope you enjoyed the episode. I encourage you to subscribe. Please leave a review. I want to know what you think. Also, if you know someone who would be a fantastic guest for 365 Brothers, please direct them to our website, 365brothers.com. You'll also find all the episodes there, 365brothers.com. And your support is welcome. And remember, to listen is to love.